My name is Friederike Ernst, and I'm one of the co-founders of Gnosis, and I will talk to you about L2s and the nuances in different L2s and kind of contrast it with horizontal scaling, and hopefully convince you that they're not actually all that different from one another, and that basically there's a lot of different shades when it kind of comes to scaling. So, problem, you all know this, Ethereum itself doesn't scale. So this is a meme that actually went around about the Bitcoin people, right? So basically, Lightning was introduced and the Bitcoiners were like, oh, fantastic, this is going to help us make Bitcoin kind of the peer-to-peer cash that it was meant to be. And then basically you do the back of the envelope maths, or Ethereans did the back of the envelope maths, and they calculated that it does not have sufficient bandwidth even to open a state channel for every human at birth and close it 80 years later. So this is a far cry from peer-to-peer cash, which they were happy to point out, but we're not actually doing any better. So this is kind of that talk. So basically, if you look at kind of Ethereum today, we see that there's around 1.25 million transactions per day. Varies a bit because obviously transactions have varying amounts of gas, but that's kind of where we're at, and there's nothing to substantially change that on the roadmap for the next 3 years. So this is kind of what we have to live with. Let's kind of make examples for this. So let's assume 10%, every 10th person in the world want to register an ENS domain. That's 800 million names. Would take 2 years to actually register 10% of the population, even one ENS name, right? And you're not doing anything else on Ethereum meanwhile, right? Basically, you're literally just registering ENS names. You're not renewing them. You're also not updating content. Literally just renewal, registration. Example 2. There are 45,000 publicly listed companies in the world. So if you kind of look at 1.25 million transactions per day, that's less than 30 transfers per stock. So kind of Ethereum itself doesn't even suffice to kind of just clear trades between the largest brokers or kind of varying L2s that are on Ethereum to kind of to do that. So basically, yeah. So the solution that we came up with was make Ethereum scale via L2s. So resources were pulled into put into rollups as a solution. The ETH layer 1 core roadmap was dedicated to making this happen with things like dank sharding and so on. And that's it. Okay, not really. So, but basically this decision was actually made several years ago. So since then, kind of many more things have happened and kind of parameters have changed. For instance, it's kind of become really obvious that kind of building decentralized sequences, so basically the entities that are allowed to build blocks on the layer 2s, building decentralized versions of them, super hard. That means almost, well, actually all L2s actually have one entity or a very small set of entities that are allowed to actually build blocks, okay? And this is something that was much harder than anticipated, something that was much easier than anticipated. Not to say that it was easy, but was trust minimized and trustless bridges. So they came first, which kind of a couple of years ago, no one would have thought. So kind of what I want to confuse you with this talk, right? So basically, the picture that is often painted is kind of very black and white, and I kind of want I want you guys to go out of this lecture hall and go like, oh fuck, this is more complicated than I would have thought. Maybe kind of things are not that clear cut. So, and kind of I want you to come away with 2 different bottom lines. One is, we really need to work on bridging. And the second one, even for L2s, right? Even for L2s, we need to work on bridging. And secondly, we need more credibly neutral layer 1 block space. Okay, so let me back way up, okay? So what makes a layer 2 a layer 2? This is a super broad definition, and I'm super happy to debate it with anyone. But I think this is actually the hill I would kind of, maybe not die on, but I would at least fight on it. So a layer 2 is a network on which your assets cannot be taken from you, and from which you know you can always bridge back to L1, okay? It's a super broad definition. It doesn't tell you anything about the tech stack or anything, but this is kind of essentially at the heart what an L2 should be, is. What does this mean for state machine L2s? So I'm just talking to EVM L2s. There used to be plasma and state channels and so on. I'm just talking about state machine L2s. So you need 4 things. First thing is you need regular checkpoints on the L1 that cannot revert. So the L2 needs to tell the L1, this is my state, okay? And it needs to do that periodically, say every hour, every day, doesn't matter. This is something that's up to the L2, okay? But it needs that. And these checkpoints, they have to be irreversible. So, and then you have to bring a proof that from checkpoint to checkpoint, you're good. That your kind of other transitions you did are correct in the state of in the case of ZK rollups, or basically you have to just posit that they're good and basically incentivize people to point out if they're not good on an optimistic rollup. Okay, the third thing you need is data availability, so that you can reconstruct the entire state if needed, right? This is also why you only need it for a set amount of time. I think currently this is kind of targeted with dank sharding. So basically you get the data availability blobs and there the data is available for, I think, 2 weeks. But I think this is a parameter that's still up for discussion. So you can reconstruct the entire state even if you just have the checkpoints from checkpoint to checkpoint, right? And then the fourth point is you need a forced inclusion. So basically, if you're on an L2 and somehow the sequencer does not put your transaction into the block, you have to have a way to kind of escalate this, right? So basically, you have to be able to go to L1 and say, look, I wasn't included here. I need my transaction to be included. And that's, for instance, I want to withdraw from this L2, right? I want to go back to L1. You can force the L2 to kind of include your transaction by escalating to L1, and then the next checkpoint is only going to be valid if the forced inclusion is contained in the next checkpoint. Okay, this is kind of, sorry, this was super technical. This is kind of how state machine L2s work in terms of the requirements. Okay, so what are the benefits and costs? You inherit the security guarantees for your L2 from your L1, okay? Not only do you get that, you also inherit the security guarantees for your bridges, both the ones between your L1 and the L2, as well as the one between different L2s. So basically, this is true in theory. The bridges between the different L2s, they're not quite here yet, but I believe this. This is fine. I will let this stand. The costs that you have to pay regularly for the checkpoints, right? So basically, for the checkpoints, you actually need to post transaction data to layer 1. And for that, you kind of have to pay layer 1 gas, okay? So basically, say you have 1,000 transactions between checkpoints, then these 1,000 transactions between the checkpoints on L2 have to pay for the gas on L1. And surprisingly, the main cost actually at the moment for L2s is data availability, okay? So that people can, in principle, reconstruct the full state and kind of build a different block on top of that, because you need to know the state for that. You need to have data availability. And this is kind of why you post the transaction data into the blobs, okay? This is something that is different for Validium rollups. So CeeLo and Polygon are not going to do this. They're going to deal with data availability in another way. I will come back to that later, kind of in the kind of different nuances of L2s. Okay, so benefits. you inherit security both for your L2 as well as for the bridges between L1 and L2 and different L2s that are on the same L1, but you pay, okay? That's kind of the very simple picture. Okay, let's kind of, have a simple reminder. Native assets on any L1 are inherently secure, okay? So if you have any L1, more or less, actually any L1, let me just make this, super bland statement, natively issued assets are secure if you have one full node or own a full, or kind of have a trusted full node, okay? So even if like almost every other validator tells you that there's an invalid state transition, you would not accept it, okay? So basically on the blockchain, and that's kind of the beauty of blockchains. So on any L1 chain, native assets are inherently secure. So the assets, okay, so basically these are examples of native assets. So Circle CBI, for instance, it's on Gnosis chain, as is Monerium. Backed is also on Gnosis chain. USDC has started issuing on many chains natively. Okay, so what you actually need to worry about is the bridges, right? So basically the bridged assets. Okay, let's go, one step further. So what was the actual original plan for rollups was meant to be a temporary space, okay? So all assets were going to be issued on L1 and live natively on the L1. And then basically you have like certain applications that would kind of have a lot of transactions that could somehow be rolled together. This works well for some dApps, so things like futures exchanges, where you have a lot of back and forth trading that happens on the L2, and then you kind of pull the final balance back to L1. Okay, this was kind of the original vision of rollups. So it actually rollups buy you an incredible amount of space or scaling for dApps whose state doesn't bloat. There are also dApps whose state bloats. So, for instance, Circle CBI. This is a blockchain-based universal basic income project that's also incubated by us. You basically have a decentralized web of trust, and this is not something that you can simply pull down to L1, right? Because it's not just a simple token balance. It's a very complex matrix of token balances. So the state is too large to feasibly export to L1. PowerWeb, for instance, is the same. Many other NFT projects do. So in the original vision of rollups, rollups only worked for dApps whose state doesn't bloat. So this is clearly not what we're having today, right? So right now, what you actually have is you have rollups as permanent spaces. So this is actually a tweet that I really liked. So Rollup Centric roadmap summarized. You will live in an L2, you will consume the blobs, those are the data availability blobs, you will own nothing on L1, and you will be happy. Now kind of your token gets issued on L2, it lives on L2, it dies on L2. So let's look at kind of life on L2. Okay, so the fees on L2 are still proportional to the fees on L1, because as I told you earlier, kind of you have to frequently checkpoint, or at least periodically checkpoint to L1, right? So basically this kind of cost gets distributed to other transactions on L2. So if you actually look at l2fees.info or something, you can see that often they still spike to well above $1 per transaction. And for many, I mean, that's good for many applications. That's also economically unviable for many others. When we have the blobs, so the proto-dank sharding, EIP 4844, this will get basically cost will come down by 90%. But that's also only until demand increases, right? A factor of 10 is not actually all that much. It's not going to last us, 3 years, which is how long it will take for Ethereum to kind of actually scale better. Okay. Also, when you're on an L2, you have to deal with stuck users. Okay, so if you I mean, I told you earlier that you can force an inclusion of your transaction on L1, but then you have to pay for L1 gas. Okay, so basically, if the cost of exiting exceeds the value of the actual assets, the user is not factually but economically stuck on layer 2, right? And even if everyone could afford to pay, and it would be worth it, not everyone can actually exit at the same time, because then you have the L1 again that doesn't scale, and basically all the forced inclusions have to be included on L1. So if everyone needed to exit the L2 in an emergency, it would take a super long time. It's kind of like evacuating a huge building through a single fire escape door. Okay, there's other problems. I don't really want to go into them, but I think I also can't skip them, so I will kind of just gloss over them. Okay, L2s that are currently around are actually mutable from a single multisig. And there's good reasons for this, okay? So there's reasons they're mutable from a single multisig, but this also means basically, billions of funds are de facto kind of stored, are attackable by attacking a single multisig. So that's kind of the compromised keys attack, right? Then there's no fraud proofs for both optimism and for Arbitrum. Only certain people are allowed to submit them. The website l2beat.com, I can totally recommend it. It kind of lists all the scary details. Then we have centralized sequences. So sequences are the entities that are actually allowed to build the block, okay? This is currently all L2s. So so basically this is a meme I liked. You can tell I like memes. Select all base chain validators, and the joke being, of course, that all of them are Brian Armstrong. Okay, so how much does kind of a network in which there's only one or very small number of known entities who are allowed to build blocks, how much can that actually give you a credibly neutral platform, even if it's well-intentioned, okay? So we actually saw this after the merge, in the wake of the tornado OFAC action, that a lot of block builders actually adhered by certain rules because they were running the same software. So basically, even on a network that is actually pretty decentralized, like Ethereum, kind of the veil of decentralization is thin, and kind of so even if, say, the Coinbase sequencer or any other L2 sequencer, I don't mean to pick on Coinbase, were to receive a letter from a 3-letter agency, they would be forced to kind of censor certain transactions, and basically that kind of, even if they don't want to, right? And they would have to do it. So kind of there's power in decentralization. Okay, L2s on Ethereum. Ethereum still sees frequent updates, and that's not going to change. So Ethereum is not going to ossify. So the L2s will kind of have to be able to kind of adapt to changing Ethereum, and for that you kind of need upgrade rights for your L2. Does it have to be a single multisig? No, but also kind of any sort of upgrade rights always comes with kind of with drawbacks. So an example of this is Snapshot X that is going to be broken by Verkle trees. Okay, so now let's go back to the beginning. So I told you that L2s provide security guarantees primarily for bridged assets, okay? So the native assets of any chain are already secure if you have the option of kind of running a full node yourself, okay? So what about if we just fix the bridges, okay? So this is a map of zones from Cosmos. Cosmos actually does this. So basically, Cosmos actually has many networks that are kind of trustlessly connected with one another, but they don't technically settle on one another, okay? So this is kind of the Etherverse, as an analogon to the Cosmoverse that we see in Cosmos, okay? So basically what you will actually have in the Etherverse is you will have execution consensus layer chains like Ethereum that kind of look very much like Ethereum with kind of trust minimized or even trustless bridges. I will get to how we make them in just a second. And in a way that would kind of give you a network of networks. And then you can have rollups on Ethereum, and you will need them, but you can also have rollups on other chains. So kind of it's kind of this, if you look at kind of how Ethereum currently scales, it's kind of this inverted pyramid. Basically, and I would make the case that not only do we basically is that, I mean, that's fantastic. You need the L2s, you need the L3s, but you also need friendly networks that kind of connect to Ethereum trustlessly and offer more L1 block space. Okay, so ZK bridges are a game changer. So basically, the way that a ZK bridge works is you have a light client that runs in a zero knowledge circuit on either chain, and that way kind of you can the target chain can always know the state of the origin chain. Okay, so this allows us to kind of come up with this equivalent of Cosmos's IBC. I want to call it inter-Ethereum protocol, just because it's basically the same as in Cosmos. Okay, then let's talk about kind of secure in theory and secure in practice, okay? So I told you that bridges between L1s and L2s are inherently secure. This is not quite true, okay? So this, if you actually look at the data of historic bridge exploits, there's a very specific category of bridge exploits that are prevented from kind of being an L2, okay? And I can recommend this GitHub, basically lists all the different bridge exploits, and you can actually look at them, as I did here. And basically, if you look at the full list, the ones I marked in yellow, those are the ones that would have been prevented by being an L2, okay, compromised keys. All the other ones, smart contract bugs, those are not vulnerabilities that would have been prevented from these chains being an L2 on Ethereum, okay? So that's, I mean, basically, if you do the math, it's of the ones in the last year and a half, it would have been 25% of bridge hacks that would have been prevented by the chain being an L2 on Ethereum. Okay, so solution to this is Hashi. Hashi is the Japanese word for bridge, and what it actually does, it's super simple. It basically just looks at different bridges between the same two chains and sees whether the bridge header as relayed by these different bridges is the same or different. Okay, so if it's the same, then you can act under the assumption that everything is well. If it's not the same, one of the bridges is broken and you stop. Okay, you kind of need to fix it via governance and so on, but in principle, it's kind of like a multi-sig of bridges. Okay, it gives you additive security. It's agnostic to the underlying mechanisms, so it kind of works with any kind of bridge. This is kind of the Hashi architecture. I'm leaving the repo here, so you can check it. So L2s, they leverage decentralization of L1. That's fantastic, but we can't stop investing in decentralization and producing more credibly neutral block space. This is what we're doing at Gnosis. So Gnosis has 130,000 validators around the world. That's 20% of Ethereum in 76 countries. Ethereum is in 86 countries. So basically, this is kind of like, this is a decentralized network. And kind of having L2s built on Gnosis and kind of having these intact, this kind of solves your first problem, kind of trusting the network. And then kind of trusting the bridges has to be something that kind of is, it comes kind of in several waves, right? So basically having trustless bridges, having Hashi, and so on, basically just building in redundancy, because basically being an L2 in and of itself is not going to save you. Okay, so let's come full circle and look at the definition of an L2. So an L2 is a network on which your assets cannot be taken from you, and from which you can always bridge back to an L1. If you actually think about this, it's possible for chains to kind of be L2s to each other, okay? So basically, chain A could be an L2 to chain B, and chain B could likewise be an L2 to chain A. Probably should find a different name than L2 for this. I have no good suggestions. You guys come up with suggestions, so BFF chains or federation of networks, whatever. So what would that look like? So you would have regular checkpoints and proof of correctness on both chains. You would have optimistic data availability on both chains, and you would have forced inclusion in both directions. And you can actually kind of make this more gas efficient than L2s are today, from kind of making data availability optimistic, okay? This is kind of what L2s currently spend the most money on, and then you can kind of have this this kind of federation of networks that are just trustlessly connected to one another. So I know I kind of overwhelmed you with lots of information. If I confused you, I did it right, because kind of I just wanted to kind of make sure to poke everyone and kind of tell you that kind of the simple narrative that we have for L2s is too simple. But I'm super happy to kind of chat after this or at another time if you kind of if you're interested. You can find out more here. We are hiring as always, and we are organizing our own conference called DAppCon in September in Berlin. It's very much like ECC, but much smaller. So thank you.
There is some questions.
I confused everyone sufficiently that there's no questions.
Maybe I have questions. Do you have any release date for the Hashi?
The Hashi? It's live. You can,
okay.
Yeah, it's live.
Thanks.
Cool.
Question? Yeah, nice.
Thanks, Friederike. I was just curious, is Hashi similar to what Layer 0 is doing? And could you comment further on the trust assumptions on the bridging?
Yeah, it's the same idea. So basically the trust assumptions on the bridging is basically you just have, you mean for Hashi, right? Okay, yeah, so basically what you do is kind of, you kind of look at multiple bridges in parallel, and if they all agree, you act under the assumption that everything's good. I mean, clearly, it could be possible that all bridges are hacked at the same time, right? But basically, since they may have different mechanisms or at least be different builds, that's unlikely. It's kind of like all clients for a network going down at the same time. So basically, it kind of gives you additive security, and kind of it also protects you from smart contract bugs, right? So basically, because not everything is always malicious, sometimes it's also just neglectful or kind of, didn't see it coming sort of thing. So kind of, Hashi kind of gives you, it's kind of like, this is a little bit disrespectful to the bridge engineers, but it's kind of like putting a sieve in a sieve in a sieve in a sieve in a sieve, and then basically you will have no leakage. That's kind of the idea. The only downside is that basically, I mean, there's two small downsides. One is kind of that there's a minimal gas overhead, kind of by kind of aggregating these bridge headers, and the second one is that the speed of your oracle is the slowest speed of the oracles you're aggregating, right? So yeah.
So thanks.